I want to welcome you to Soil 2018. We're glad you're with us today. If anybody was wondering, I'm Neil Hamilton, your host, and want to thank you for being here. Lots of folks to thank, our wonderful array of speakers. All you folks are going to be speakers, raise your hand so they can get a preview. Look at that. A great array of friends and colleagues and people we know are going to put some flesh on the bones of this idea. I want to thank our sponsors too. You'll see them listed in the program. Special thanks to Dr. Jerry Hatfield and the USDA National Agricultural Laboratory on agriculture and the environment. All right, it's a mouthful, but they do fabulous work, and Jerry's the leader there. I want to thank our exhibits. You have a number of them you can check out at the breaks. I want to thank my colleagues at the center. Certainly want to thank Anna Jordan, the Policy and Outreach Coordinator, or as many of you may know her, the new Matt. Where's the old Matt? We should have him raise his hands too. But Anna will be here and working with us today. And Anna did a great job assembling the program that you have. Thanks to Morgan Gardner, our undergraduate social media intern, for helping promote the conference. And a special thank you to our array of students, many of my Drake Environmental Regulation of Agriculture students. Would y'all raise your hand so I can do an inventory here? Look at them. They're sitting in the back, but let's thank them. We may have a few Drake undergraduates come through today. And we also have a delegation of students from the University of Iowa Sustainable Water Development Graduate Program. And I think you're kind of over on this side. Why don't you raise your hands, too? They came over to be with us from Iowa City this morning. It's appropriate that you're all here with us since we're looking to the future. Well, first, I thought I'd start with a little history about our Sustaining Our Iowa Land initiative. This is really an example of Drake using our power to convene. And our first soil conference was in 2015. It focused on soil and water conservation policy. How many of you were here today, were here in 2015 for that conference? There you go. I appreciate the loyalty in you following it. Soil 2017 examined the role of private landowners in stewardship. And as most of you know, we launched another component of our educational effort, the weekly Our Water, Our Land videos that are designed to bring a little bit more balance and objectivity to the discussion. And I guess I could ask how many of you actually watch those videos. Oh my God, look at that. I tell you, our YouTube counter is not working exactly, but I'd encourage you to send in a comment or send in ideas that you might have. This conference is an extension and a continuation of those efforts, and why we're here today. Our reality is that we have a little bit of a mixed bag in Iowa. We've spent at least 3 generations working on soil conservation with much progress, but we still have some work to do, as you'll hear from Jerry and Liz. We've spent over 30 years working on water quality and the role of agriculture. Though today some people act like the issue is a new development, which seems to be a little surprise. We're going to hear many examples of positive news and attitudes of care, and I think that's the good news. But weighed against that good news, I think, is also the reality that in many ways we may be losing ground. I think in our attention and our concern for resource protection, as it may be overwhelmed by economic concerns and ideology. And at least from where I sit, part of our challenge is, the truth is, we have little evidence that water quality in Iowa is improving. There's certainly examples of progress, but I fear that they may pale against the sheer magnitude of our challenge. And certainly the recent University of Iowa study that talked about the loading of nutrients into the Mississippi and Missouri show that. And to think that Iowa could be contributing 55% of the nutrients entering the Missouri off of 10% of the land and less than 5% of the land and 10% of the water should be a wake-up call, just as it no doubt is disturbing news to those downstate. Well, we've got some pictures here. I always like to show some pictures of my family. There's old Ham on our farm. down in Adams County. And Zell, my mom, and the well that we used to pump our water out of. We didn't have running water in the house till I was about 6, and one of my jobs was to pump buckets of water. And, things have changed a little bit. And of course, Ray's looking at these pictures. He knows this farm well. And we all go through changes in life. And our land and our values remain, I think, for the most part. And, in many ways, we face, I think, a policy environment that may be marked by resistance and indifference, and in some situations, what perhaps may be ineffectual actions. Our new water quality law, Senate File 512, was a bad bill when it was rejected in 2017. It didn't get any better when it was enacted this year, but it's our law. The nutrient reduction strategy is long on science, but relatively devoid of a policy or a strategy for implementation. We face a fairly serious shortage of funds, yet the legislature is unable to muster the support to increase the sales tax to fund natural resource protection. But this year it did find time to cut funding for REAP and impose what I would describe a foolish moratorium on the use of the state revolving fund for clean water projects. And so this isn't necessarily a pretty picture, at least from some perspectives. Last fall I gave a talk at the University of Iowa Public Health and Water Quality Conference here at Drake, and it was titled High Hopes Meet Hard Truths. And it examined the issues we face, and it was, I think, a critical but perhaps honest appraisal. And in my view, honesty is something that we could perhaps use a little bit more of, rather than happy talk and wishful thinking that marks a fair amount of our discussion. And so if this talk today was an update, the new title might be Fewer Hopes and Harder Truths, because my fear is that, I think we may be tiring of these issues, and we may be willing to believe that our efforts are adequate and more time is all we need. I don't necessarily share that view, and I don't think that perhaps many of you do here today either. I think too much of our state is in jeopardy to be complacent, and Iowa doesn't need a collective exercise in can kicking of delay and denial and deflection on resource management. I think our citizens and communities want and deserve more. The farmers and conservationists who are working to protect the land know more is needed, and I think we owe it to our children and the resources to be responsible stewards rather than apologists, to embrace the type of land ethic that Leopold so eloquently set out for us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that chap, but, and of course that was Ding Darling, and you'll hear a little bit more about Ding, and Ding of course captured the fertility and the richness of our state, but he also captured our challenges in terms of our soil and our water, and even though these may have been penned 70 or 80 years ago, they may also be relatively current. And there's 1 mile of our cubic soil, right? 1 cubic mile of soil getting ready to depart. This is one of my favorites of his, right? Time to take an inventory of our pantry that Mother Nature spent, right, generations putting up for us. And so Leopold. Well, Leopold wrote about our relation to the land and how the idea of obligations is largely missing from our discussion of conservation. And he said our education, quote, makes no mention of obligations to land over and above those dictated by self-interest. And he noted, quote, we've been too timid and too anxious for quick success to tell the farmer the true magnitude of his obligations. Obligations have no meaning without conscience, and the problem we face is the extension of a social conscience from people to the land. And so, right, there's Leopold's conclusion. And we spend a fair amount of time, I think, asking the land to do for us. But do we consider what we owe to it? You know, I've spent my career, which is potentially drawing to a close, as a law professor, and as our students in the back can tell you that the world of law is built on rights and obligations. And our discussion of water and land issues, I think, needs to consider both rights and obligations, just as Henry Wallace said in 1938 when he was writing about, right, our duty to the soil. And one of his wonderful quotes from the foreword to the 38 yearbook, the social lesson of soil waste is no man has the right to destroy soil even if he does own it in fee simple. We owe a duty to the soil we've been slow to recognize. Well, believe it or not, based on what I've just said, I try to live in a spirit of optimism, and though I do temper it with a dash of cynicism. That's what brings me to our purpose today. You know, in thinking about how we could structure a Soil 2018 conference to add value to our discussion and to make it worth your time to attend, and I want to again thank you all for attending, several ideas came to mind. One of the first ideas that I talked about, and a number of you in the room I probably talked to this idea about, was, well, what if we looked at the Raccoon River watershed and asked about how we could bring all of these various programs and goodwill and efforts, the things that many of you are working on, to bear so that we could try to turn the Raccoon into a national model for successful water quality efforts. That's a good idea. Maybe that's next year's conference, right? But it's not this year's. Instead, I've been working on the Ding Darling and his history, and we have some efforts underway here at Drake today, now, as we speak, to build on his legacy of leadership. And I was struck by his vision, his emphasis on taking on planning and taking the long look. And those are certainly traits that he shared with Leopold and Wallace, who were friends and contemporaries. And, of course, Ding drew what Wallace knew, right? It's the only kettle she's got, the soil that we're feeding ourselves from. And he also knew that, as goes the land, so goes man. But he also knew that nature would recover. And so I remembered, seeing a copy of the Iowa 25-year conservation plan prominently displayed in Joe McGovern's office at the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, and so I borrowed it. And it's a fascinating book. Darling and his colleagues and a commission and the state agencies at that time worked for months to develop a comprehensive plan that was published in 1933 that covers all different parts of Iowa's natural resources, from wildlife to water and people and all parts in between. And we can still see the results of that as you go around the state today, because many of the state parks and properties that became County Conservation Board parks were identified in that 25-year plan. And so I thought, well, why don't we do this for this Soil 2018 conference? To step back and to take a little bit longer of a vision, rather than focusing on reacting to the latest crisis of the moment and whatever's in the news, questions like who killed the Leopold Center, or why would we cut REAP, or why would we put a moratorium on using the state revolving fund for land projects, or, and this is a laugh line, Laura, so I included it, or who will Bill sue next? I don't think he has plans to sue anybody next, all right? Those are important questions, no doubt. But in some ways, I think they narrow our focus, and they're in some ways diversions from perhaps this larger issue. And so what might happen if we step back and take a longer version, or a longer vision? and think about what we want, why it's important to protect land and water and why we value them. And, I think as an example, if you've ever read the nutrient reduction strategy, which some have, maybe not as many as think they have, but if you've ever read it, one of the things that at least strikes me about it is that it's relatively soulless, right? There's no discussion about why we're protecting water quality, or what are the values that we're obtaining once we do this, or even what success might look like. And instead, it appears the only reason we have one is because the EPA told us to do it. And okay, that's a reason, but I don't know that it's a sufficient reason. And it isn't necessarily a reason that asks us the right questions. I don't think that's what motivates you in your work. You know why these resources are important. You know why you're doing what you're doing on your properties, and the longer vision that you're taking. And you know that conscience brings with it obligations. And you know we need to ask questions like who speaks for the land and for the water and for the wildlife. And so I think by taking a longer vision, right, and there's the whole issue. Ding wrote about this question of who is it that actually gets to speak for wildlife. And if you can see, everybody else over there is lined up for their aid, the farmer aid and the banker aid, and even the mosquitoes are getting a little bit. But these game animals and all these other resources, and they say, well, I guess we'll have to go into politics to organize themselves. But so what happens, perhaps, if we take a longer view? I think, and this is certainly my hope, the speakers we're going to hear here in a few minutes, is that we can begin to articulate a vision, but it also lets us consider some more concrete questions. How will we measure our progress, and what will success look like? What obstacles stand in our way, and how do we address them? And what actions can we take, and are we taking? What are the models we can use, and what are the examples for progress? And what institutions do we already have in place that we need to harness to build on? So these are the questions that I asked each of the speakers to consider. And in fact, I think most of you got an email that asked you to consider these questions as well and invited you to share a vision. Some of you did, and I appreciate that. But as we hear them share their visions, we can distill, I think, a collective vision. And we'll see some natural overlaps. Like what we'll hear Jim P. say, that Iowa can't really think about the future of wildlife if we don't think about the future of our rivers and streams. And as they identify the obstacles and perhaps more importantly, the actions that we can take, I think it might be possible for us to begin to etch out an agenda for future work. And so that's the idea for today. That's our goal. Going to ask ourselves the vision. Is there a fatted calf? Or did we already eat the cow? As Ding is telling the prodigal son in this situation. And so that's the idea for today. Is it too lofty? Well, perhaps. Is it worth the effort? I hope so, but you'll have to be the measure of that, right? Because you're really the body and the content of this. As a final comment, though, let me share what I believe are some of the common elements that we may need for this vision, a foundation for us to build on. And I think in some ways what we need may mirror what we may be missing. And if you watched last week's episode of Our Water, you'll know it was about the restoration of Lake Darling. And I want to commend Steve Hopkins and all his colleagues at DNR and everybody else who was involved in that wonderful restoration. But a number of these ideas may seem familiar. I think we need a sense of urgency, a recognition of the need to act. And we need a vision or a plan for what it is we're trying to do and a shared understanding of the reasons why, the values that we're promoting. And that vision would then help us identify a strategy, and a strategy would help us prioritize our actions. As opposed to trying to spread the frosting across the whole cake, maybe there's a piece or two that need a little bit more frosting, right, in terms of our attention and our time. And we need ways to measure our progress. And I know, Larry, in your publication from the Flood Center, you folks make this point, right? That we need to know what's working so that we know whether or not our investments are actually paying off, right? We just can't kind of helicopter money out the door and know that it's being spent, but not necessarily thinking about how it's being spent or what the collective or cumulative actions might be. We need community support, and that was certainly part of the story in Lake Darling. And whether it's a region or a watershed or the citizenry of a state to support the actions, we need adequate funding from public sources and private investment. And as I said before, I think the truth is the funding that Iowa devotes to water quality and conservation is inadequate. Yet we can't even necessarily be honest with ourselves in terms of how much we're even spending, right, in terms of the things that we're willing to account. And we also need cooperation, from farmers and landowners working at the local and watershed level. Individual efforts like the ones you're going to see today, and you'll hear Ray and Seth, Liz talk about on their farms, they're important and they're inspirational. But we're going to need, I think, action on a much wider scale, right, and collective action if we think we're going to move the needle. And so we have to engage those structures and those institutions. Where are the soil and water conservation districts? Let's break the drainage districts out of a mindset where all they can do is drain water and can't think about how they're draining it or what they could do to help clean it. The watershed management authorities, right? And I'm pleased that we have a number of folks here today who are commissioners who are involved in those type of efforts. And finally, I think to develop the support and strategy and to obtain the funding that we need, we also need leadership, right? People being willing to invest time and reputations, willing to overcome or confront the dogma and inertia that we may face on many of these issues. So that's, there you have it. That's why we're here. That's what I hope that we're going to be able to achieve with Soil 2018. And so we're 7 minutes ahead of time. So that either leaves a long time for applause or more importantly, an opportunity to bring Jerry Hatfield up, because there's no better place to start than starting with the soil, which is this thin skin of the earth that we survive on. And so, Jerry, I'd invite you to come on up, and maybe Anna too, to help us get the PowerPoints underway.